when Texas rancher Garrett Crawford stepped into his barn one October evening in 2008. His wife expected him back within minutes. But he never returned home. The massive search effort found nothing, as if the vast desert had simply erased him from existence. Then, 4 years later, an afternoon jogger's retired police dog began frantically digging at a peculiar rock formation, uncovering evidence so bizarre it transformed a missing person case into something far more sinister. The call to the Brewster County Sheriff's Department came in just after 9 p.m. on a Tuesday in October 2008. The voice on the line belonged to Sarah Crawford, and it was strained with a tension that cut through the line's static. Her husband, 58-year-old Garrett Crawford, was missing. It was a simple, terrifying fact. He had walked out of their modest ranch house 2 hours earlier, heading for the main barn about 100 yards away. He'd told her he needed to check on a rattling sound in the old John Deere tractor he'd been nursing along for the better part of a decade. He said he'd be right back. 2 hours in the vast, isolating expanse of West Texas can feel like a lifetime. At first, Sarah hadn't worried. Garrett often lost track of time when tinkering with machinery, his focus absolute. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the rugged landscape in shades of orange and purple before plunging it into an unnerving darkness, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. She had called his name from the porch, her voice swallowed by the sheer scale of the open space. The only reply was the chirping of crickets and the lowing of distant cattle. She walked to his truck, a dusty Ford F-150 that was as much a part of him as his worn boots. The driver's side door was unlocked. On the passenger seat, his keys lay next to a small pile of receipts from the feed store. His wallet was not there, but it wasn't unusual for him to leave it in the house. The sight of the keys, however, sent a chill through her. Garrett never went anywhere without his truck. It was his office, his transport, his connection to the outside world. Seeing it sit there, silent and empty, felt profoundly wrong. After another frantic check of the house and the immediate yard, she made the call. A lone deputy, a young man named Rick Ortega, arrived 40 minutes later, his patrol car's headlights sweeping across the dusty driveway. The Crawford Ranch was remote, miles down a gravel road that branched off a secondary highway. It was the kind of place where neighbors were distant figures and self-reliance was a creed. As Ortega stepped out of his car, the immense, star-filled sky and the profound silence of the night underscored the property's isolation. Sarah and her eldest son, Ben, met him on the porch. Ortega listened patiently as Sarah recounted the evening's events, her voice trembling but clear. He learned that Garrett was a man of routine, a third-generation rancher whose entire life was mapped out by the seasons and the needs of his livestock. He wasn't a drinker, he wasn't known to have enemies, and he had never disappeared before. The three of them walked to the barn, their flashlight beams cutting cones of light through the darkness. The large sliding door was partially open, just as Garrett had left it. Inside, the air was thick with the familiar smells of hay, earth, and motor oil. A single, bare light bulb, hanging from a rafter, cast long, distorted shadows across the cavernous space. The barn was cluttered, but organized, a working space filled with tools, feed sacks, and equipment. There were no overt signs of a struggle, no overturned hay bales, no bloodstains in the dirt, no signs of a panicked exit. Deputy Ortega conducted a methodical search. Near the front of the hulking green tractor, he found a heavy combination wrench lying on the packed dirt floor. It was directly beneath the engine block, as if it had been dropped in the middle of a task. It was the only thing that seemed out of place. It suggested an interruption, an abrupt halt to a simple, mundane chore. A man fixing his tractor had simply vanished into thin air. Back in the brightly lit, sterile environment of the family's kitchen, Ortega took their formal statements. Sarah and Ben described a man buckling under immense pressure. The ranch, their legacy, was failing. A multi-year drought had decimated their herd, and commodity prices were low. They admitted Garrett had grown quiet and withdrawn over the past year, the weight of potential foreclosure a constant unspoken presence in the house. Bank letters had been arriving with increasing frequency. Still, they were adamant he would not have just left. To abandon the ranch, the land his grandfather had broken and his father had built, was unthinkable. It was a betrayal of everything Garrett stood for. As the clock ticked past midnight, with no sign of Garrett and no evidence of foul play, Deputy Ortega had no choice. He radioed in the details. Garrett Crawford was officially logged as a missing person. The initial assessment, based on the evidence, or lack thereof, was that the rancher may have finally succumbed to the crushing financial stress and walked away. It was a logical theory, but to the two people sitting in the silent kitchen, it felt like a dismissal of the man they knew. They knew something terrible had happened. They just couldn't prove it. As dawn broke the day after Garrett Crawford vanished, the scale of the official response became clear. The Crawford Ranch transformed from a place of quiet solitude into a bustling command center. Brewster County Sheriff's Department, bolstered by Texas Rangers and a stream of volunteers, established a perimeter. The initial search was a formidable display of community and duty. Neighboring ranchers, men whose faces were etched with the same sun and worry as Garrett's, arrived on horseback, their familiarity with the rugged terrain an invaluable asset. They fanned out in disciplined lines, their eyes scanning the gullies, thickets of mesquite, and rocky outcrops that defined the landscape. The land itself was the primary adversary. It was a vast, unforgiving tableau of rock, sand, and thorny brush. A person could easily get lost, fall into a ravine, or be bitten by a rattlesnake. Every shadow seemed to hold a possibility, every cave a potential resting place. A helicopter from a regional law enforcement agency chopped through the air overhead, its crew using thermal imaging to search for any heat signature, any sign of life. But the hours bled into one another with a frustrating lack of discovery. They found deer tracks, coyote dens, and the occasional discarded beer can from decades past. But of Garrett Crawford there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a torn piece of fabric, not a single clue to suggest which direction he might have gone or what fate might have befallen him. The searchers combed every inch of his property and the adjacent lands, a grid that expanded with each passing day, but the earth seemed to have swallowed him whole. While the physical search continued, the investigative side of the case fell to Detective Miles Corbin, a veteran with 20 years on the force. Corbin was a methodical, pragmatic man who believed that most mysteries were solved not by flashes of brilliance, but by the patient accumulation of facts. He had seen men break under pressure before, and the story of Garrett's financial ruin was a familiar one. With a duly signed warrant, Corbin and a junior detective began the meticulous process of dissecting Garrett Crawford's financial life. It was worse than the family had let on. The paperwork told a story of quiet desperation. There were multiple loans, a second mortgage on the property, and a stack of letters from the bank, each more threatening than the last. The language shifted from polite reminders to bold, red-stamped notices of intent to foreclose. The ranch wasn't just struggling, it was in its death throes. To Corbin, this was a powerful motive. He saw a proud man, the patriarch of a family and the steward of an ancestral legacy, facing the ultimate failure. The shame could be unbearable. The theory that Garrett had simply walked away, unable to face his family and the loss of everything he'd worked for, hardened from a possibility into Corbin's primary working hypothesis. It was clean, it was logical, and it fit the pattern of similar cases he had studied. The investigation, however, had to explore all avenues. A routine canvass of local businesses turned up a promising, if volatile, lead. A clerk at a farm supply store in Alpine recalled a heated argument between Garrett and the store's traveling salesman, a man named Dale Roper, just a week before the disappearance. The clerk reported hearing raised voices from the back office, with Garrett accusing Roper of price gouging and Roper threatening to cut off his credit entirely. The words, "You'll regret this," were allegedly spoken, though by whom the clerk wasn't sure. Roper was brought in for questioning. He was a portly man in his late 40s, sweating under the harsh lights of the interview room. He readily admitted to the argument. He explained that Garrett had been a good customer for years, but his account was severely delinquent. The confrontation was, as he put it, unfortunate but necessary business. He was nervous, but his story was consistent. More importantly, his alibi was ironclad. On the night Garrett disappeared, Dale Roper was over 200 miles away in San Angelo attending his daughter's school play. He provided a program with his daughter's name in the cast list and a list of a dozen family members who could corroborate his presence. The lead evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. It was another dead end. Weeks turned into a month. The large-scale search was scaled back, though volunteers and family members continued to look whenever they could. Then a flicker of hope arrived via a phone call. A cashier at a 24-hour truck stop off I-10 nearly 150 miles east reported seeing a man who matched Garrett's description. She said he'd come in 2 days after the disappearance was reported on the regional news. He looked haggard and thin, she recalled, and had a deep sadness in his eyes. He bought a cup of black coffee and a newspaper, paid in cash, and stared out the window for nearly an hour before leaving on foot. The family's hopes surged. It was the first tangible possibility that Garrett was alive. Detective Corbin and Deputy Ortega drove the 3 hours to the truck stop. The cashier repeated her story with conviction. The crucial piece of evidence would be the security footage. They huddled around a small monitor in the back office as the manager played the tape. The quality was poor, a blurry black and white stream of indistinct figures. The man in question did bear a passing resemblance to Garrett, same height, same build, same weathered look, but his face was perpetually obscured by shadow and the low resolution of the camera. It was impossible to make a positive identification. The flicker of hope was extinguished by digital noise. Just as the investigation was losing all momentum, Sarah Crawford made a discovery that challenged the core of Detective Corbin's theory. While sorting through the mountain of paperwork on Garrett's cluttered desk, searching for an insurance policy, her fingers brushed against a business-sized envelope tucked inside a ledger. Inside was a check. It was from a cattle auction house made out to Garrett Crawford for the sum of $17,450, payment for a small herd he had sold 6 weeks prior. The check was uncashed. She immediately took it to the sheriff's department and presented it to Corbin. Her argument was simple and powerful. Why would a man running from his debts leave behind nearly $18,000? It was enough to keep the bank at bay for a few more months, to buy them time. It made no sense. For the first time, Corbin felt a flicker of doubt in his own theory. A man fleeing in a panic might forget his wallet, but would he forget a check of that size? He logged the check into evidence, but it didn't point toward any alternative suspect. It was simply a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, an anomaly in an otherwise straightforward narrative. By the spring of 2009, 6 months after Garrett Crawford had walked into his barn and never returned, the case had grown cold. There were no new leads, no new sightings, and no new evidence. The phone had stopped ringing. The official search was formally suspended. The case file, now thick with interview transcripts, financial reports, and dead-end leads, was placed in a metal filing cabinet in the records room. It sat alongside dozens of other unsolved cases, other lives interrupted, other families left in a state of suspended grief. For the public and for the law, the search for Garrett Crawford was over. For his family, the silent, agonizing wait had just begun. The first anniversary of Garrett Crawford's disappearance arrived with the quiet solemnity of a funeral for a man who was not confirmed to be dead. The West Texas Chronicle, a regional paper, ran a small article on an inside page. The headline was simple: 1 year later, rancher's disappearance remains a mystery. The piece was a brief, dispassionate summary of the case. It recounted the initial call from a frantic wife, the massive but fruitless search, and the lingering theory of a man overwhelmed by debt. The article included a photo of Garrett taken a few years prior, the same one the family had provided to the sheriff's department, the one where he was smiling, leaning against a fence post, looking every bit the stoic, capable rancher he had been. To the wider public, the story served as a somber, fleeting reminder of a local tragedy. For the Crawford family, it was a public confirmation of their private limbo, a printed testament to their unanswered questions. The financial pressures that had haunted Garrett did not vanish with him. They fell like a crushing weight onto the shoulders of Sarah and their son, Ben. The daily reality of running the ranch was a relentless grind. Fences still needed mending, cattle still needed feeding, and the bills continued to arrive with merciless regularity. Ben, who had been planning to attend agricultural college, deferred his plans indefinitely, stepping into the immense void his father had left. He worked from sunup to sundown, his youthful energy slowly eroded by the sheer scale of the labor and the ever-present anxiety of their financial situation. Sarah, meanwhile, navigated the bureaucratic nightmare of her husband's legal status. He wasn't dead, so she couldn't claim life insurance. He wasn't present, so she couldn't make major financial decisions without a power of attorney she didn't have. The ranch was bleeding money, and the bank's patience was wearing thin. After another year of struggling, of selling off cattle at a loss and patching equipment with wire and hope, Sarah was forced to make a decision that felt like a betrayal. She met with a representative from a large agricultural corporation based out of Dallas. In a sterile office that smelled of new carpet and ambition, she signed the papers to sell off a 600-acre parcel of the northern pasture, the very land Garrett's grandfather had first claimed. The money from the sale was a temporary lifeline, enough to settle the most immediate debts and keep the bank from foreclosing on the main house and the remaining property. But as she watched the corporate surveyors drive stakes into the ground, marking the new boundary line, it felt like she was selling off pieces of Garrett himself. In the digital world, the mystery of Garrett Crawford flickered with a life of its own. On internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries and missing persons cases, his story became a subject of detached speculation. Anonymous users, shielded by screen names, dissected the few known facts. Theories proliferated in the vacuum of evidence. Some argued for the simplest explanation. Garrett had walked into the desert and succumbed to the elements, his remains scattered by coyotes and bleached by the sun, forever lost to the vastness of the landscape. Others spun more elaborate tales. They debated the significance of the uncashed check, suggesting it was a plant, a deliberate piece of misdirection. The confrontation with the salesman, Dale Roper, was re-examined, his alibi questioned. Was it possible he had hired someone? A more popular theory, given the ranch's proximity to the border, was that Garrett had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see, a drug deal, a stash of contraband, and had been silenced. These conversations, however, were ephemeral. Without new information to fuel the fire, the threads would inevitably sink, replaced by newer, more sensational cases. For the online sleuths, Garrett Crawford was a puzzle. For his family, he was a phantom limb, an ache where a husband and father used to be. The cruelest moments were the flashes of false hope. Nearly 3 years after Garrett had vanished, a call came from Sarah's cousin in southern Oklahoma. She was breathless with excitement, convinced she had just seen Garrett at a local diner. The description was perfect, she insisted. The same height, the same walk, even the way he held his coffee cup. For a few frantic days, the Crawford house was filled with a nervous energy it hadn't felt in years. Sarah and Ben allowed themselves a sliver of belief. They contacted the local sheriff in Oklahoma, who agreed to follow up. The wait for the return call was agonizing. When it finally came, the news was delivered with gentle finality. The man at the diner was a retired oil field worker who had lived in the area for 40 years. It was a case of mistaken identity. The silence that followed the phone call was heavier than ever. The brief surge of hope made the subsequent crash into reality feel all the more brutal. It was a lesson in the cruelty of wanting to believe. By the fall of 2012, 4 years had passed. The mystery of Garrett Crawford had receded from public consciousness, becoming a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered among ranchers. The case file at the sheriff's department was thick with dust. Detective Miles Corbin was just a year away from retirement, and the Crawford case was one of a handful of unsolved files that he knew would be passed on to his successor. The world had moved on. For the Crawford family, however, time had not healed the wound. It had simply transformed it. The sharp, piercing grief of the early days had subsided into a chronic, dull ache. Life was now defined by the absence. There was an empty chair at the dinner table, a set of tools in the barn that no one touched, a silence in the evenings that was never truly comfortable. Sarah had learned to live with the ghost of her husband, a constant presence in a house that felt too big and too empty. Ben had become a man, his face now carrying the same lines of worry that had once marked his father's. They no longer spoke of Garrett in the future tense. The question was no longer, when will he come back? But, will we ever know what happened? As the 4th anniversary approached, it seemed almost certain that the unforgiving Texas desert would keep its secret forever. In the spring of 2012, 4 years after Garrett Crawford's disappearance had settled into the cold, hard geology of an unsolved case, a woman named Maria Sanchez was doing what she did 3 times a week: jogging. Her route was a dusty, sun-baked trail that snaked through a patch of state-owned desert land several miles from the old Crawford ranch. It was a landscape of stark beauty and profound emptiness, where the silence was broken only by the wind and the crunch of her running shoes on the gravelly soil. She was not alone. Trotting faithfully by her side was Buster, a handsome German shepherd she had adopted from a rescue organization a year earlier. Buster was not just a pet, he was a professional in retirement. For 7 years he had served as a K-9 officer with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, specifically trained in human remains detection. Their routine was always the same. They would run for 2 miles, Maria lost in the rhythm of her breathing and the vastness of the sky, Buster trotting contentedly, his nose occasionally twitching at the scent of a jackrabbit or a coyote. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, under the glare of a relentless Texas sun, the routine shattered. About 1.5 miles in, Buster suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears went flat, his body tensed, and a low whine emanated from deep in his chest. Maria slowed to a walk, calling his name. He ignored her. His focus was absolute, directed towards a small, unremarkable cluster of rocks and creosote bushes about 50 yards off the trail. Before Maria could react, Buster bolted. He moved with a purpose she had never seen before, a focused intensity that was unnerving. He ran directly to the base of a large, flat slab of sandstone, a boulder that, upon a second glance, seemed oddly positioned, as if it hadn't settled there naturally, but had been placed. Buster began to bark, not his usual playful yapping, but a frantic, insistent series of deep-chested barks. He pawed at the ground, digging furiously, sending sprays of dirt and pebbles into the air. A cold dread washed over Maria. She knew Buster's history. She knew what his training meant. She approached cautiously, calling his name again, but he was locked in his task, his instincts overriding years of domesticity. The area smelled of dust and dry vegetation, nothing out of the ordinary to her. But Buster's frantic behavior was undeniable. He was alerting. Maria's mind raced. It could be an animal carcass, she told herself, but she had seen him encounter dead animals before. He would sniff with curiosity and move on. This was different. This was the behavior of a dog who had found what he was trained to find. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Standing alone in the immense silence of the desert, with her dog digging at a potential grave, she felt a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. After several minutes of panicked indecision, she pulled out her cell phone. Her hands were trembling as she dialed 911. The dispatcher on the other end of the line was professional but audibly skeptical. Maria did her best to explain the situation, her voice tight with anxiety. "My dog, he's a retired K9, she repeated, trying to lend credibility to her story. "He's trained for this. He's alerting on something near a large rock off the old Juniper Trail." The dispatcher took down the information, promised to log the call, and said they would try to have a unit check the location when one became available. The non-committal tone left Maria feeling foolish and unnerved. She managed to leash a still whining Buster and head back to her car. The image of the frantic digging burned into her mind. Later that afternoon, a Brewster County Sheriff's deputy, a young man barely a year on the job, was dispatched to check on the woman with the crazy dog. He drove his patrol car as far as the trailhead and walked the rest of the way, the afternoon heat radiating off the ground. He was expecting to find nothing, another wild goose chase in a long shift. He found the cluster of rocks Maria had described and saw the disturbed earth where Buster had been digging. He was about to dismiss it when he noticed something subtle. The soil directly around the base of the large sandstone boulder was looser, darker, and less compacted than the surrounding terrain, which was baked hard by the sun. It looked as if it had been turned over at some point, though not recently. He recalled the dispatcher's notes about the dog's K9 background. While it still felt like a long shot, protocol was protocol. He knelt down and examined the area more closely. He couldn't see anything, but the placement of the boulder still felt wrong. It was too flat, too conveniently positioned to cover the patch of disturbed earth. A prickle of unease ran up his spine. He stood up, took a deep breath, and made a call. He requested a small forensics team. He might get chewed out later for wasting resources, but he would rather face a sergeant's reprimand than be the guy who ignored a potential burial site. Within 2 hours, a small team arrived in a county van. They were seasoned, their faces impassive. They photographed the scene, took soil samples, and then, using heavy pry bars and a winch, they began to lever the massive sandstone slab aside. It moved with a groan of protest, scraping against the smaller rocks beneath it. As the boulder was shifted, it revealed what it had been hiding: a shallow oblong pit about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. There was a collective intake of breath. The pit did not contain a body, at least not an obvious one. Instead, it held a carefully placed pile of what looked like men's clothing. The fabric was faded and stiff with dirt, but the items were distinct. An investigator, wearing black nitrile gloves, carefully reached into the pit. He first lifted a worn, brown canvas jacket, its texture rough and brittle. Beneath it was a pair of blue jeans folded neatly and a light-colored button-up shirt. It was a strange, almost ceremonial arrangement. Then he saw it. As he lifted the jacket, he uncovered the centerpiece of the bizarre cache, the object that would elevate this from a strange discovery to a haunting enigma. Resting on top of the folded shirt was the bleached, pale shell of a large desert tortoise. It was old, the scutes of the carapace clearly defined, and wrapped around it, holding it in place like a grotesque sash, were several strips of silver-gray duct tape. The tape wasn't just holding the shell, it was securing something to the top of it. It was a man's cowboy hat, stained, misshapen from its time underground, and with a small puncture hole in the crown. It was unmistakably a cowboy hat, duct taped to a tortoise shell, buried with a man's clothes in the middle of the desert. The scene was utterly silent for a moment, the investigators staring at the object, a symbol of some cryptic, unknown ritual. The items were meticulously documented, photographed from every angle, and carefully bagged as evidence. Back at the sheriff's department, the strange collection was laid out on a sterile table in the evidence room. The photos were uploaded to the county system. When Detective Miles Corbin got the call, he was at his desk, sorting through paperwork for his impending retirement. He was tired, looking forward to a life of fishing, and not thinking about the worst of what people could do to each other. The young deputy on the phone described the find, and Corbin's interest was piqued by the strangeness of it. He pulled up the evidence photos on his monitor. He stared at the first image, the brown canvas jacket. It was familiar. He clicked to the next photo, the one of the hat. It was a light tan, resistal-style hat, common enough in this part of Texas. But there was something about the specific shape, The crease in the crown. He felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline that he hadn't felt in years. He pushed his chair back and strode down the hall to the records room, pulling the key from his pocket. He unlocked the large metal cabinet labeled Cold Cases and flipped through the hanging files until he found the one he was looking for. Crawford, Garrett. He pulled out the thick file and opened it on a nearby table. The first thing he saw was the missing person poster from 2008. There was Garrett Crawford, smiling slightly, leaning against a fence. He was wearing the same brown jacket. On his head was the same light tan cowboy hat. Corbin's blood ran cold. He stared from the photo in the file to the image on his computer screen. It was a perfect match. After 4 years of silence, the desert had finally given up its secret. The Garrett Crawford case was no longer cold. It was active, it was bizarre, and it was now, without a shadow of a doubt, a homicide investigation. The task of informing the next of kin is the heaviest a law enforcement officer has to bear. For Detective Miles Corbin, driving the familiar gravel road to the Crawford Ranch, the weight felt heavier than ever. He wasn't just delivering news of a death, he was extinguishing 4 years of torturous, flickering hope. He found Sarah Crawford on the porch, her hands tending to a pot of geraniums. She looked up as his car approached, a question in her eyes. She knew this wasn't a social call. Corbin didn't bring the evidence with him. The items were too macabre, too personal. Instead, he sat with her at the same kitchen table where the nightmare had begun, and he laid out a series of high-resolution photographs. He started with the jacket, then the jeans. Sarah's breath hitched, a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. She nodded slowly, her face paling. When he showed her the photo of the hat, stained and misshapen but undeniably Garrett's, her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust of a long day on her cheek. She confirmed they were his clothes, the ones he was wearing the day he vanished. The last desperate hope that he had simply walked away to start a new life, a painful but survivable theory she had secretly clung to, was gone. In its place was the cold, hard certainty of a violent end. The investigation was now officially a homicide, and Sarah Crawford was now officially a widow. Back at the sheriff's department, the investigative team was fixated on the most bizarre element of the discovery: the tortoise shell. It was the centerpiece of the crime, a deliberate, symbolic act that screamed for interpretation. Initial brainstorming sessions went nowhere. Theories ranged from a local occult group to a lone deranged killer with a personal psychotic signature. The act seemed too ritualistic to be random, yet too specific to fit any known pattern of criminal behavior. It was Detective Corbin dredging up a memory from a border task force briefing years ago who had the breakthrough. He remembered a DEA agent talking about the strange symbolic language used by drug cartels, a world of unspoken rules and brutal messaging. On a hunch, he made a call to a DEA liaison officer based in El Paso. The liaison, a man named Agent Suarez, agreed to look at the photos. When Corbin described the scene over the phone, the cowboy hat duct-taped to a tortoise shell, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Suarez's voice was grim when he finally spoke. He explained that in the lexicon of narcoculture, particularly among older, more traditional smuggling groups, the turtle, or tortoise, an animal that hides in its shell when threatened, is a potent symbol. It is used to represent a soplon, a snitch, an informant, someone who talks to the police. The message was clear and chilling. This is what happens to rats. This single piece of information was the key that unlocked the entire case. It was as if the investigators had been trying to read a book written in a foreign language, and Suarez had just handed them the dictionary. The theory of a proud man fleeing his debts dissolved completely, replaced by a far more sinister narrative. Garrett Crawford hadn't been running from his life. He had been silenced by a secret one. With this new terrifying lens, Detective Corbin's team reopened Garrett's financial records. The first time they had looked, they had seen only what they expected to see: debt and desperation. Now they were looking for something else entirely: unexplained income. They painstakingly combed through 4 years of bank statements, transaction histories, and deposit slips. And they found it. Tucked among the legitimate, documented income from cattle sales were dozens of small, irregular cash deposits. They ranged from $500 to $2,000, made at inconsistent intervals over the 8 months leading up to his disappearance. During the initial investigation, these had been dismissed as likely off-the-books sales of individual cows or farm equipment, a common practice for ranchers trying to generate cash flow. But viewed through the cartel lens, the pattern was damning. The deposits didn't align with auction seasons. They were too small, too frequent, and too random. It looked less like ranching income and more like a series of payments. In total, they added up to nearly $50,000. Garrett Crawford hadn't just been in debt, he had been on someone's payroll. The revelation galvanized the investigation, but also led it to a frustrating wall. The deposits were cash, untraceable. The cartel cell responsible was likely long gone or had changed leadership. For months the case simmered with this new knowledge, but no clear path forward. The break came from the place it so often does, the sprawling, rumor-filled ecosystem of the prison system. In a federal penitentiary several hundred miles away, an inmate named Hector Morales, serving the 3rd year of a 15-year sentence for drug trafficking, was watching the evening news. A local station was running a follow-up story on the turtle shell grave, a sensationalist name the media had coined for the Crawford case. Morales froze. He knew what it meant. He knew who used to operate in that part of Texas. Facing another 12 years behind bars, he saw an opportunity. He told his lawyer to contact the Brewster County District Attorney's office. He had information about a murder. A deal was cautiously brokered. In exchange for a potential sentence reduction and a transfer to a safer facility, Morales agreed to talk. Detective Corbin and Agent Suarez flew to the penitentiary to conduct the interview. Morales was a mid-level trafficker, not a boss, but he had been with the organization for years. He was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, even in the secure interview room. But he laid out the entire tragic story of Garrett Crawford's final months. He confirmed that Garrett, desperate to save his ranch, had made a deal with the devil. A local cartel cell, looking for a low-profile staging point for shipments coming across the border, had approached him. The Crawford ranch was perfect, isolated, vast, and owned by a man under extreme financial duress. The deal was simple. Garrett would allow them to use a corner of his large remote barn for temporary storage. In exchange, he would receive regular cash payments. According to Morales, Garrett was a reluctant participant, racked with guilt but seeing no other way to avoid foreclosure and the loss of his family's legacy. For a while, the arrangement worked. The payments came, and Garrett was able to keep the bank satisfied. But the cartel's ambitions grew. The cell's leader, a ruthless man known only as El Martillo, the Hammer, decided to expand their operation from drug smuggling into the more lucrative business of human trafficking. He informed Garrett that the barn would now be used to hold people, primarily women and children, who were being moved north. This was a line Garrett Crawford would not cross. He was a father. The idea of these vulnerable people being held like cattle in his own barn horrified him. He refused. He told the cartel's enforcer the deal was off and that he wanted them off his land. He made a fatal mistake. He threatened to go to the police. He never did, Morales explained, but the threat was enough. In their world, you didn't have to be a rat. You just had to think about becoming one. El Martillo could not risk a witness with that much knowledge of his operation. Morales recounted the night Garrett was taken. It wasn't a struggle in the barn. 2 men simply waited for him, grabbed him, and forced him into a vehicle. They didn't kill him right away. They took him to a remote abandoned house across the county line. For several days, they tortured him. Their goal wasn't just to punish him, it was to get him to sign the deed to his ranch over to a front company they controlled. They wanted his land, his legacy, as the ultimate price for his defiance. But Garrett refused to sign. He refused to give them his home. When it became clear he would not break, El Martillo gave the order. After they killed him, they disposed of his body in a place, Morales said, that would never be found. The elaborate burial of his clothes was a separate, calculated act. It was a symbolic grave, a piece of narco-theater. It served two purposes. It was a final, degrading insult to the man who defied them, branding him a snitch for eternity, and it was a chilling, unmistakable message to anyone else in their network. This is the price of morality. This is the fate of those who say no. Hector Morales' confession painted a vivid and horrifying picture of Garrett Crawford's final days. It provided answers, context, and a clear motive for a crime that had baffled investigators for 4 years. The abstract puzzle pieces, the financial desperation, the uncashed check, the bizarre burial, snapped into a coherent, tragic narrative. For the investigators, it was a moment of profound clarity. For Garrett's family, it was confirmation of their deepest fears and their proudest beliefs. The story, however, offered no path to legal closure. The informant's testimony, while compelling, was ultimately just that, the word of a convicted felon seeking to reduce his own sentence. It was a powerful lead, but it was not enough to secure a conviction in a court of law. The primary obstacle was the absence of Garrett Crawford's body. Without it, there was no physical evidence to corroborate Morales' account, no ballistics, no DNA, no crime scene to process. The murder of Garrett Crawford was, in the eyes of the law, still a theory. Furthermore, the main architect of the crime, the man known as El Martillo, had proven to be as elusive as a ghost. Federal agents discovered that he had fled to Mexico shortly after the Crawford incident, likely sensing that the operation had become compromised. He had vanished into the vast, opaque world of the Sinaloa cartel, beyond the reach of American justice. The other men involved, known to Morales only by nicknames, were untraceable. The case had been solved in principle, but it remained open and unprosecuted on the books, a permanent file in Detective Corbin's cabinet, which he passed on to his successor upon his retirement. Yet the investigation was not without consequence. The information provided by Morales, combined with the financial trails uncovered by Corbin's team, gave federal agencies a crucial foothold. They launched a broader, multi-agency investigation into the cartel's activities in the region. Over the next 2 years, the intelligence gleaned from the Crawford case led to a series of targeted arrests and seizures. The cell that had exploited Garrett's desperation was systematically dismantled, its network disrupted, and its operations crippled. While the men who killed Garrett Crawford were never brought to trial for that specific crime, the organization they worked for was shattered. His unwilling sacrifice had, in a way, prevented countless other potential victims from being caught in the same web. For the Crawford family, the truth was a bitter form of peace. The agonizing uncertainty that had haunted them for years was replaced by a grim understanding. Sarah and Ben finally learned that Garrett had not been a victim of his own weakness, a man who had fled from his responsibilities. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of profound desperation, but who, when confronted with true evil, had found a line he would not cross. He died not because he was weak, but because he was, in the end, a man of principle. He refused to allow his family's home to be a cage for the innocent, and he paid the ultimate price for that refusal. The ranch he fought so hard to save, the land that was woven into his very identity, was ultimately lost. The money from the initial land sale had only postponed the inevitable. Without Garrett, and with the emotional and financial toll of the preceding years, Sarah and Ben could no longer sustain it. Piece by piece, the remaining acreage was sold off to developers and larger agricultural consortiums. The old barn where Garrett was last seen was eventually torn down, replaced by a modern irrigation pivot. The Crawford legacy, measured in land and cattle, had come to an end.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, Give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.